A 747 plummets towards the Pacific Ocean.
People just popped up like popcorn.
This airplane is totally out of control. It is going to crash.
In 2 minutes, China Airlines Flight 006 drops 10 kilometers through the clouds.
Airspeed 270, 280, 290.
The plane begins to tear itself apart as it spirals towards the sea.
And I closed my eye. I thought I was gone.
Altitude 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet. Emergency, emergency.
February the 19th, 1985. A China Airlines flight cruises across the Pacific to Los Angeles. At 12,000 meters, it's racing towards the dawn. For the passengers and crew on board, it's past midnight. A two-man relief crew is in charge of the plane as it sails above the ocean on autopilot. The main crew gets several hours off in the middle of the trip, so they're rested for the landing. But Captain Mumyan Ho is restless.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Even though he's not officially on duty yet, Captain Ho returns to the cockpit.
Thought I'd keep you company.
The captain isn't the only one up. Best friends Sexan Canyo and Alex Knoll have something to celebrate.
I feel like I'm in first class.
It's Sexan's 30th birthday.
I have the longest birthday because I just gained my 12 hours back. And we've been drinking champagne, celebrating 41,000 feet in the air. You know, not too many people get to do that.
Bill Peacock is in first class. He's traveled all over the world for the American government.
There was nothing special. It was a routine commercial flight. I had a very nice first-class seat, sat there and read some books, went to sleep.
By now, the plane is nearing the coast of California.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will shortly be serving you breakfast. For those of you who wish to adjust your watches, the local time in Los Angeles is now 7 a.m.
Sleep well?
Very well, sir. Thank you.
Good morning, Captain.
After their 5-hour break, the flight crew is reunited in the cockpit. Soon after, the plane runs into some stiff winds.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
We're experiencing some light air turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelt.
The autopilot is set to keep the plane flying at 470 kilometers an hour. But with the wind blowing hard, it's increasingly difficult to maintain the speed. For the crew, the bumpy ride suddenly gets more worrying.
Engine 4 is giving us weak thrust.
There's a problem with one of the engines. The flight engineer throttles up the engine, but it doesn't respond.
We're losing speed.
Back in economy, Sexan Canyo has also noticed something.
You notice the light in that wing isn't flashing anymore. So what?
I thought there was some light blinking at the tip of the wing. Looked like a cone. But when I look back this time, I didn't see no cone.
Oh, the light in that wing's still flashing.
I think you had a few, buddy. Have a seat.
In the cockpit, The strange situation suddenly gets much worse.
Engine 4 flamed out.
The fourth engine stops working completely.
Take a look at engine out procedures. Work out a 3-engine cruise altitude. Yes,
The
Captain.
problem with the fourth engine isn't a complete surprise. At the pre-flight briefing, Captain Ho was told that a repair crew had worked on engine 4 before the flight. Perhaps the engine still wasn't working properly.
We had a snag advisor on engine 4 before we took off.
Yes, sir.
Maybe that's it.
Without the fourth engine, the plane continues to slow down.
Airspeed 240.
Call Oakland Center and request a lower altitude.
Oakland Center.
Dynasty 006, requesting new altitude.
Dynasty 006, stand by.
Reignite engine 4.
Yes, Captain.
At this altitude, there isn't much oxygen, so the chances of a successful relight are slim.
No response, Captain.
As the crew try to restart their engine, their plane slowly begins to roll to the right.
Dynasty 006, you're cleared to flight 240.
We're banking right, Captain. Airspeed 230.
As the plane continues to turn and slow down, it's in danger of stalling.
Altitude hold off. Nose down.
Hoping to increase his speed, Captain Ho tries pushing the plane's nose down. Nothing the crew does seems to help. Their jet is banking more and more steeply.
Dynasty flight 006, Oakland Center, how do you hear me?
Airspeed 220. We're banking right, Captain.
I'm disengaging autopilot.
For the first time, Captain Ho takes manual control of the plane. He struggles with the controls, but the plane has veered into thick cloud, and he can't see the horizon as he tries to keep his jet level.
I've lost ADI.
The ADIs have malfunctioned.
It's going out of limits.
Just minutes after their fourth engine stopped working, the China Airlines flight suddenly stalls and begins falling from the sky.
People just popped up like popcorn, hitting the cabin, and all the tray was flying. Hot tea, pots, noodles, and all the luggage in the compartment were hitting people.
You could hear rivets popping. It sounded like bullets were hitting the outside of the aircraft, which, you know, we're out in the middle of the ocean. Nobody's shooting at us.
At that time, we didn't know we were going to live or die.
China Airlines Flight 006 is out of control and hurtling towards the ocean. A China Airlines jet is tumbling out of the sky. After losing power to one engine, the jet is spinning out of control. It's dropping fast, straight towards the Pacific Ocean.
You can see the stewardesses, all these people who didn't have their seatbelt on, they were flying.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, how do you hear me?
The crew are stunned, blindsided by their jet's bizarre behavior.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 have lost thrust. No
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, how do you hear me?
Airspeed 270, 280,
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, how do you hear me?
Struggling against the plane's wild motion, the flight engineer tries again to restart his fourth engine. The G-forces are so powerful that the flight engineer is pinned to the control pedestal.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, do you copy? You need to see this.
In Oakland, air traffic control spots the plane's sudden descent. In a matter of seconds, the plane falls almost 3,000 meters.
up to 370, 360, 350.
In the cabin, the G-forces are punishing.
I closed my eye. I thought I was gone. I thought the plane just blew up in the midair.
The plane is about to exceed its maximum speed.
Approaching VMO.
Tumbling madly through the clouds, the 747 finally starts to pull out of its nosedive. As the plane rights itself, the G-forces change direction. The passengers are pressed to the floor, feeling 5 times their normal weight.
I remember looking over at this dignified, older Chinese gentleman who was sitting across the aisle from me. And his face was being contorted like this, like he was lying on his side in a wax museum in a fire. I mean, his face was just all contorted.
As the crew struggles to regain control of the plane, it begins to slow down.
Airspeed 180 knots and falling.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, how do you read me?
Airspeed 140 knots and falling.
The jet is still dropping, but not as fast. This could be the crew's chance to regain control.
I knew we were really in trouble because G-forces, instead of being horizontal, started moving around to the vertical. So we were being pushed down into our seats instead of sideways.
As their speed continues to fall, the flight engineer reaches desperately for the engine throttles.
Airspeed 80 knots and falling.
But the engines don't respond.
No response. The engines are flamed out.
After tumbling 3,000 meters in 30 seconds, the jumbo jet plunges again into another free fall.
And the second time when it went down, this time it's plunge. I mean, it went down.
The change is swift. Once again, the passengers feel pulled towards the nose of the plane.
You know, this airplane is totally out of control. It is gonna crash. And stuff, we're sliding around and flying around and shoved to one side and then shoved to another side. So it was kind of like being on a boat that gear is broken loose and it's just going back and forth with the waves. Ugly.
My stomach was up to my throat. You smell people urinating in their pants.
I really made peace with the Lord. And I said, to myself, I said, I've really had a wonderful life. If this is the end, I'm ready to do it.
Up to 250. Airspeed 290.
As the plane spins towards the ocean, the airspeed increases rapidly.
Dynasty 006.
With the crews struggling to control the plane, 6 separate calls from air traffic control go unanswered. The stress of the dive tears the landing gear doors off the plane. In less than a minute, the plane drops 6 kilometers.
Hold on! Let's link arms!
He said, "I love you, man." I told him, "I love you, man." And we said goodbye to our wife. And he said something about his belonging. He gave all his belonging to his wife. And that's when we just start pushing our chair back together.
Altitude, 15,000 feet.
With no visible horizon line, Captain Ho doesn't know which way is up.
We pass PMO.
Without a reference, he can't stop the plane from spinning.
Emergency, emergency.
After blindly plunging thousands of meters, the plane finally breaks free from cloud.
And when this thing was falling down, it looked like you have a magnifying glass and you went like that, and all of a sudden the white water break becoming closer and closer, faster and faster. It's like incredible, and we thought we were going to die.
Altitude, 12,000 feet.
As he struggles for control, Captain Ho has only 30 seconds before his crippled plane smashes into the ocean.
I can see the horizon.
Altitude, 10,000 feet.
For the first time since beginning his harrowing descent, the captain can now use the horizon line as a reference in leveling the plane. As he tries to pull the plane out of its dive, the passengers pay the price. Their bodies are forced into their seats, battered by another dramatic change in direction.
You know, the G-force was so strong, and I weighed 200 pounds, so my weight was almost 1,200 pounds.
It's a race against time, and the plane starts to win.
ADI is coming back.
As the plane finally begins to level, the attitude indicators return to normal.
ADI's coming in.
More importantly, as mysteriously as the incident began, 3 of the plane's engines regain power.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 are coming back. Engine 4 still negative.
Reignite engine 4.
Yes, Captain.
Once again, the flight engineer tries to reignite the 4th engine. But this time,
Engine 4 reigniting.
for the first time in minutes, the plane is flying under control.
They saved the airplane. They pulled the airplane out of this acrobatic maneuver at an altitude of 9,500 feet. They popped out of the clouds at 11,000 feet, and they had the airplane in stable level flight by 9,500 feet. That was a masterpiece of flying.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. Is anyone hurt?
Do we have a doctor on board?
There's a gentleman sitting behind me, all splattered with blood from hitting the compartment. So we kept flying. And next thing I knew that the whole plane was quiet, real quiet. Nobody talked very much. If they talk, we're whispering because we don't know, we still don't know we're gonna live or die.
Dynasty 006 fell off my screen, but she's back now.
A new controller, Brian Campbell, has taken over control of Dynasty 006.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center, do you hear me? Can you fly the plane?
006, we are flamed out. We are... emergency. We are 9,000. 9,000.
Roger, roger. We have radar contact.
Oakland Center, Dynasty 006, we can control the aircraft.
Roger, roger.
Less than 10 minutes after the start of their problems, everything seems normal again.
Request radar vectors to return to course.
There really is nothing I can do to assist. He's the pilot, he's flying the airplane. I'm going to give him a safe altitude to descend to. I'm giving him a destination. It appeared to me that he was well in control of his aircraft.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center. Are you declaring an emergency? Do you want to divert to San Francisco?
Negative, Oakland Center. Condition normal now. We will continue to Los Angeles.
Dynasty
Air traffic control clears the plane to climb to 10,500 meters. But a new problem soon arises.
Roger, Oakland Center. Captain, our landing gear is down and walk. Can you bring them up? Negative. The hydraulic fluid in System 1 is empty.
For some reason, the plane's landing gear is down. Hydraulic fluid, which controls the gear and many other parts of the plane, is also leaking away.
Oakland Center, Dynasty 006, request new clearance to maintain flight level 270.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center. Do you have injuries?
Stand by, Oakland Center.
Sir, are you okay? My head.
One passenger has suffered serious injuries, and 24 others have cuts and bruises.
006, we have at least 2 injuries on board.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center. Are you declaring an emergency? Do you want to divert to San Francisco?
Stand by, Oakland Center.
Oakland Center, Dynasty 006. We're declaring an emergency. We request a direct route to San Francisco.
Well, they cleared all the other airplanes out of the way. They gave him clear runway, so nobody was waiting. Didn't have to wait for anybody else. He went straight in for a landing.
Dynasty 006, Oakland Center. You are now cleared. You are free to descend at pilot's discretion.
Captain Ho not only has injuries on board, the plane itself has been severely damaged. His rear elevators, which help control the altitude of the plane, don't seem to be working. Without them, landing his jet safely will be extremely difficult.
The problem is, it's a very big airplane and it responds very, very slowly, and you just might not do it before you run out of air. You might hit the ocean. What you need is a very cool head.
Captain Ho must now land using varying amounts of engine thrust. After pulling the plane out of its terrifying dive, if he makes one mistake, Flight 006 could still end in disaster. Nearing the end of a trip across the Pacific Ocean, China Airlines Flight 006 falls suddenly from the sky.
No response! The engines are flamed out!
Emergency! Emergency!
After a terrifying plunge, the crew manages to wrestle the plane level again. But the jet is badly crippled. The elevators aren't working. Without them, Captain Ho has to land mostly by reducing power to his engines. It's a controlled fall towards the runway.
As we came in, we flew over the house in Atherton where I had lived, where my kids had been born. And I looked down and said, boy, this is fitting. If we don't make it down, or if this plane explodes on landing because it's been so badly torqued and ruptured, you know, at least I got to see that. He made one of the best landings I've ever seen. I mean, it was just perfect touchdown.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Ho speaking. Wishing you a safe journey. I hope you enjoyed our
uneventful flight. Thank you for flying China Airlines.
I thought he was a hero. He saved our life. I mean, how can we fell we didn't know how far we fell that time. And we thought he was a hero and everything was fine.
On the ground, the full extent of the damage to the plane can be seen.
I saw this enormous piece of extremely complicated machinery that is much larger than most buildings, sitting there on the tarmac with bits ripped off it. Parts of the entire tailplane at the end were ripped off, as though a tornado had come through or a crane had been in and ripped pieces out of it. It was a very sobering experience.
It's clear why the crew had such a hard time landing the plane. Enormous chunks of the tail are missing, either torn off by the stress of the dive or crushed when the landing gear doors broke loose. If the damage had been much more severe, the crew wouldn't have been able to regain control of their jet. 24 passengers have minor injuries. Only one requires hospitalization, but is soon released. A near disaster was avoided. But what had gone wrong in the first place? The National Transportation Safety Board arrived that very day and launched their investigation. The cockpit voice recorder is sent to Washington, but it's designed to tape over itself every 30 minutes. None of what happened in the cockpit during the terrifying plunge from the sky remains.
Without a cockpit voice recorder, we had to reconstruct what the crew said and how they interpreted things and what was going on in the cockpit to the best of our abilities with the other data that was available to us.
A record of the plane's instrument activity during the flight has been captured by the flight data recorder. But again, the team runs into a problem. The flight data recorder experienced unprecedented stress during the dive. There were electrical interruptions too, which caused gaps in the recording. The FDR information will have to be recovered using painstaking techniques of reconstruction. It's a frustrating start to the investigation. Investigators begin with what they do have. Passengers and crew report that just before the failure of the jet's fourth engine, the plane flew through unexpected turbulence. Had this caused the engine to fail? Satellite weather maps reveal that there was indeed heavy air turbulence over the Pacific. But it wasn't severe enough to cause engine failure. The jet's 4 engines are tested and studied. Even after the horrific dive through the sky, they're found to be in working order. However, given the previous history of problems with Engine 4, it receives particular scrutiny.
They had an anomaly with one of the engines. They believed that the engine had flamed out or that there was something seriously wrong with the engine.
The wear on a small throttle valve trimmer is measured. It's worn down by only 4/1000th of an inch, but that's enough to restrict the fuel flow to Engine 4.
Engine 4 is giving us good thrust.
Investigators determined that at 12,000 meters, Engine 4 did indeed deliver weaker than normal thrust. It's known as a hung engine. The aircraft logbook reveals that Engine 4 had been written up on 2 previous occasions just the week before. Perhaps the engine wasn't properly fixed, which led to the China Airlines mishap. The NTSB decided to dig deeper into the history of maintenance on Engine 4.
We had a snag advisor on Engine 4 before we took off.
Yes, sir.
Maybe that's it.
But after weeks of investigation, the NTSB concludes that the engine didn't need to be replaced. All the repairs were done according to the book. A faulty engine was not the cause of the accident. And even with the loss of one engine, the plane shouldn't have been in immediate danger.
Engine 4 flamed out.
A 747 is designed to fly on only 3 engines.
The loss of thrust on a 4-engine airplane is a minor event. It's an event, you have to take care of it, but the airplane is easily retrimmed and the airplane will fly on 3 engines with no difficulty.
We're banking right, Captain. Airspeed 230.
The airplane is perfectly capable of flying. It's not as efficient because it's got this big, round, drag-producing device out there, not producing any thrust. But given that it's not going to get quite so many miles per gallon, otherwise it's perfectly flyable.
Take a look at engine out procedures. Work out a 3-engine cruise altitude.
Yes, Captain.
There are standard procedures to follow in the case of an engine failure, but the crew of the China Airlines flight hadn't followed them. They tried to reignite the engine immediately instead of descending.
Reignite engine 4.
Yes, Captain.
They attempted to restart much too high. You are supposed to attempt to restart an engine only below 30,000 feet. They were at 41,000.
What is a little curious to me is why they didn't use the normal relight procedure. They were starting to try to relight the engine at altitude, and that would likely not relight.
No response, Captain.
It's a mistake, but it shouldn't have led to the plane spiraling out of control. So how had a manageable problem turned into a near disaster?
I've lost ADI.
The ADIs have malfunctioned.
It's going out of limits.
To get more information on what was happening in the cockpit, investigators interview the flight crew.
I heard the captain report the ADI was lost. And then I saw the standby ADI was also going out of limits.
The crew tell investigators that their ADIs, which measure how level the plane is, weren't working.
They could have said, this can't possibly be right. And looking at their indicators, can't possibly be right, and therefore they must have failed.
The attitude indicator had indicated a position so implausible that it looked like it had to be a failed instrument. This couldn't be what the plane was really doing.
But in fact, when the ADIs are studied by the NTSB, they're all found to be perfectly normal.
When we started banking right, engine 4 was already flamed out. We started to descend faster, and engines 1, 2, and 3 also failed.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 have lost thrust!
NTSB investigators are even more confused when the crew tells them that all of their engines had failed.
No response, Captain!
With the exception of engine 4, the flight data recorder indicates that the other 3 engines were working the entire flight.
Ignition negative!
If the engines had all failed, there would have been a host of other problems, such as cabin depressurization, but that didn't happen.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 are coming back.
Finally, when we descended lower in altitude, 1, 2, and 3 came back, and we were able to reignite engine number 4.
Engine 4 reignited.
At the end of the dive, the crew had the plane under full power. It was a remarkable recovery. But to investigators, it's a puzzle. The story the crew is telling doesn't match up with the evidence they've uncovered. After months of investigation, the NTSB team slowly pieced together a reenactment of the plane's near catastrophe over the Pacific. It includes information from the reconstructed flight recorder, personal interviews, and the air traffic control transcript. When the work is complete, there's only one conclusion. Apart from a problem with a small valve, there was nothing wrong with the 747 before it plunged from the sky. In fact, it was the crew that made a series of fateful decisions that almost crashed the plane. Just after 10 o'clock Pacific time, engine 4 starts to lose thrust.
Engine 4 is giving us weak thrust.
The flight engineer struggles to fix the problem. But investigators discover that he doesn't take one of the most basic steps he should have. He leaves the engine's bleed air valve on. The bleed air valve takes air generated by the engine to help cool the plane. When an engine isn't working properly, the valve is supposed to be closed, so the engine can use all available air to restart.
It's a little puzzling that the flight engineer didn't shut off bleed air. And in my mind, the most likely reason for it is that he didn't expect to be told to restart the engine at 41,000 feet. And so when the captain instructed him to try some restarts, he just kind of wasn't ready with his checklist. He was doing something out of order. And that's why it didn't occur to him to shut down the bleed air. The end result is that the engine, which is slow to start, won't start at all.
Unwittingly, the flight engineer has started a ticking clock. Engine 4 is slowly losing its ability to stay lit.
We're losing speed.
With more engine power on the left wing than the right, the China Airlines flight begins turning.
In order to keep it from turning to the right, the proper thing to do would have been to step on the rudder. That would have produced a twisting force, so to speak, that would have overcome the imbalance of the engines.
But instead of adjusting the rudder himself, Captain Ho continues to let the autopilot fly the jet. The autopilot is designed not to move the rudder. The autopilot can adjust the ailerons and spoilers on the plane's wings, but these flaps aren't strong enough to overcome the imbalance that the plane is experiencing. Without the help of the rudder, the plane's turn becomes steeper and steeper.
Now, it's possible that he'd forgotten that the autopilot didn't use the rudder. He may have been assuming all along that the autopilot was just flying the airplane the way a human being would have, which it wasn't.
Engine 4 flamed out.
Investigators discover that after losing power to his fourth engine, Captain Ho continues to leave the autopilot on. He doesn't take complete control of the plane. He doesn't adjust the plane's rudder with his left foot.
Airspeed 240.
He didn't use the rudder to compensate for the lack of thrust on the right outboard engine. The airplane started to lose speed, and one thing led to another, and in the end, it was really that little error of airmanship, the failure to step on that left rudder pedal, that triggered everything else.
Reignite engine 4.
Yes, Captain.
Rather than taking control of flying the plane, Captain Ho's attention seems to be focused on his engine problem, something that his flight engineer could handle on his own.
No response, Captain.
It's really critical that attention be paid to flying the airplane. But it's happened over and over again in aviation that the crew gets focused on a problem with a system, in this case an engine, but it could have been a light bulb, it could have been any other malfunction. And if everybody's focused on that and nobody is flying, then they're not prepared for what's happening to the airplane.
The plane enters a critical moment. It's about to flip on its side and enter a nosedive. The NTSB believes that the captain was concentrating on his airspeed indicator, but seemingly fails to notice the instrument directly beside it, his attitude indicator. This instrument would have warned him that his plane was starting to roll alarmingly to the right.
They concentrated on one part of the phenomenon and lost the full picture. And as they lost the full picture, they lost apparently a very important part of any instrument flying, which is the scan. You look at all of the primary instruments, one after the other, and whatever is going on, you look at them all constantly.
During the plane's nosedive, it flies through thick cloud. With no visual horizon as a reference, the flight crew must trust their instruments to level the plane.
I've lost ADI.
Instead, what investigators believe happened is that the crew became spatially disoriented. They decided that their instruments were failing.
They simply didn't believe what they were seeing, and they thought they had lost their attitude instruments. They hadn't lost their attitude instruments. The airplane was, in fact, embarking on an aerobatic maneuver.
The most probable reason for all three crew members believing something so unlikely as that all attitude indicators could malfunction in the same way at the same time is that the way in which they malfunctioned was so unexpected and strange that it didn't seem to correspond to any possible thing that the airplane could be doing. The airplane had in fact rolled over on its back and gone into a vertical dive, and that's something that Boeing 747s don't typically do.
As the plane begins tumbling towards the ocean, another critical lapse in judgment occurs.
The standby ADI was also going out of limits. I tried to restart.
During interviews, the flight engineer told the NTSB that all 3 of the plane's working engines failed.
We started to descend faster, and engines 1, 2, and 3 also failed.
But the flight data recorder shows that, in fact, they were still working. In the heat of the crisis, the engineer had made an enormous mistake.
Engines 1, 2, and 3 have lost thrust.
The investigation reveals that as the plane fell, the thrust in each engine was indeed reduced dramatically. But the cause wasn't engine trouble. The engine throttles had been lowered to idle in an attempt to slow the furious fall of the jet. It was something the engineer missed in the chaos of the dive.
You can understand why the flight engineer might have been confused about this situation if he had not seen the captain pull the power to idle on the engines. He would reasonably assume that the fact that they went to idle was a problem rather than intentional.
Investigators also believe that they know why the engines didn't give the crew more power when the engineer tried to throttle them up. The cold temperatures at 9,000 meters would stop them from responding quickly.
No response, Captain!
But in the heat of the moment, the engineer could have taken their slow response as another indication that they failed. The NTSB discovers that indeed gauges in the generator panel behind the engineer showed that the 3 engines were still firing.
Ignition negative!
But the gravitational force became so powerful, the engineer couldn't look back. After months of painstaking recreation, the NTSB investigators believe they understand what happened inside the cockpit of China Airlines Flight 006. But what they don't understand is why. The crew's medical records are examined. Was there something wrong with the captain that might explain the bizarre behavior? Nothing turns up.
You know, it wasn't just the 3 Stooges who, won a trip on a 747 or something. It was a trained crew, highly experienced, thousands of hours.
How could an experienced crew make so many fundamental mistakes? The investigators find the answers in the hours before the incident. What they uncover is a potential danger that affects pilots around the world. In 1985, a series of small pilot errors lead to a terrifying plunge from the sky. Spinning wildly out of control, a China Airlines flight tumbled 10 kilometers towards the Pacific Ocean. By the time the crew regained control, the plane was badly damaged. Amazingly, everyone on board survived. Investigators have uncovered a series of mistakes which nearly led to the death of everyone on board China Airlines Flight 006. But how could an experienced, well-trained and healthy crew make so many mistakes? The NTSB team decides to examine all of the factors affecting human behavior, including a new field of research.
For the first time, as far as I know, in a report, the circadian rhythms, the biorhythms, the day and night functioning of the body was seriously taken into account as a possible explanation of why an extremely experienced Boeing 747 captain didn't notice things that to other pilots might have seemed obvious, such as the fact that his airplane was busy flipping on his back when he was attempting to deal with an engine problem.
Although Captain Ho had the required 15 hours off duty before flying that day, the NTSB investigators take a closer look at the captain's schedule before the night of the flight.
I do not think I was fatigued. I can't say I slept well during the flight.
This accident occurred at what would be about 2 a.m. local time. And that's pretty significant. Most people are asleep around 2 a.m. So this incident occurred at a point in his what are called circadian rhythms in his body clock, where he would be at his deepest sleep. I remember also that he had gone back there was a crew rest area on the 747, and he said he'd rested for 5 hours and slept for 2. But another thing I remember from his interview is he said, you never really sleep well on the airplane.
Captain never sleep well during the flight. I worked many years for this airline, but I never had this problem before.
That seemed like a very true statement. You know, it's hard to get a really solid sleep on the airplane, particularly if you're the person in command, as he was. So, putting it all together, we saw this was an experienced crew, a qualified crew, and they were flying on a schedule that would make them susceptible to some of the negative or adverse effects of fatigue.
During 6 flights in the previous 6 days, Captain Ho had covered a total of 18 time zones.
Thought I'd keep you company.
The NTSB research suggests that desynchronisis, or jet lag, may have been a cause.
And I think all these factors certainly would have contributed to his being performing at less than his full potential at the time.
Investigators also take a closer look at the very machinery that is supposed to make long-distance flying easier.
Take a look at engine out procedures. Work out a 3-engine cruise altitude.
Yes, Captain.
We have people in the front of airplanes because we believe that in circumstances which nobody has foreseen, the human being in the front of the airplane can react creatively, can solve a problem that nobody has thought about before in real time. And automation can't solve problems that nobody has thought about before in real time in quite the same way.
The NTSB concludes that possibly fatigued from air travel and bored by the monotony of his tasks,
We're banking right, Captain.
I'm disengaging autopilot.
the captain relied on his autopilot for too long. When he should have taken direct control, he hesitated, trusting his systems.
That is obviously a failure. The crew didn't behave as they should have behaved. Pilot error.
As a result of the China Airlines near mishap and other incidents around the same time, aircraft manufacturers began to rethink the design of their automated systems.
The idea of the automation is that it's going to help the human do the human's job. It's going to help the human take the airplane from the gate to the gate at the other end, and it's going to help along the way.
Boeing makes use of this particular incident to say we still want the crew to have full authority so that they can move the controls as far as it's physically possible to move them and to manage the airplane, even if it may bend the airplane. It is better to do that than to restrict the pilot's authority and then have him guess whether or not he's in charge or the computer's in charge.
Whatever mistakes the flight crew made that day, they did succeed in their ultimate task.
They flew the airplane well. They did an excellent job with the approach afterward. They were careful with the airplane. They knew the airplane had been damaged. They didn't know the severity of it. They were gentle with the maneuvering and yet tested enough to make sure that they wouldn't get themselves in further trouble as they made the approach to landing.
The one big thing they did right, and one only ever needs to do one big thing, is they saved the airplane. And in principle, that's all you ever need to do right when something happens to your airplane. You need to save the airplane and you need to save the passengers, and that's what they did.
How can you forget something like that? That I survived through that. So it's hard for me to forget that I was lucky and it wasn't my time yet.
The pilot saved our lives. He got us into it, but he got us out of it.
And perhaps there was one other hero that day, the Boeing 747 itself. It was put through maneuvers and stresses that far outweighed its known limits. And yet, despite it all, the aircraft survived and landed safely. Morning rush hour, Charlotte, North Carolina. Its busy airport is rocked by a massive explosion.
The flames were coming over the fence, just total craziness. Everybody was just running for their lives.
Firefighters rush to one of the airport's main hangars. They confront an inferno.
It was quite a while before we realized a plane had hit the hangar.
A packed commuter flight has plunged to the ground shortly after takeoff. Everyone on board is killed.
We kept scratching our head wondering, okay, this airplane flew 9 times previously and we had no problems.
Investigators uncover a string of errors.
Bill, I have an idea.
And learn that passengers on small planes have actually been in danger for years. It's morning on January the 8th, 2003, in Charlotte, North Carolina. A city of 500,000 wakes. At Charlotte Douglas International Airport, commercial airline pilot Captain Katie Leslie is at work early. Only 25 years old, this Texas native has been flying for Air Midwest for almost 3 years. One of the youngest flight captains at her airline.
Hey, Tom. Have a great flight.
She's a top-rated pilot building her career at one of the fastest-growing airports in the United States. This airport is an important domestic hub for U.S. Airways, with flights to most major cities in the eastern United States. Air Midwest runs a commuter service as U.S. Airways Express. It operates a fleet of Beechcraft 1900D planes, a 19-passenger short-haul commuter plane, and a trusted workhorse in the industry. Today, Captain Leslie is in command of a 1900D on a 30-minute hop to Greenville-Spartanburg Airport in Greer, North Carolina. Her co-pilot is 27-year-old Jonathan Gibbs.
How'd you sleep last night?
Had a dream I was in Miami.
Attention, ladies and gentlemen, this is the final boarding call for Air Midwest Flight 5481 to Greenville-Spartanburg. All passengers wishing to board should make their way to gate.
Among the passengers flying to Greer this morning, 18-year-old Christiana Shepard. Christiana's parents, Doug and Teresa, are Baptist missionaries working in the Portuguese Azores.
Christiana left the 7th of January from the Azores, spent the night in the airport in Boston, and then flew the next morning on the early flight from Boston to Charlotte to Greenville. So she was on her way back to college.
Christiana was very special, and she was one that would come up and give you a hug and say, you know, she'd come for no reason. She would give you a hug and say, Dad, I love you.
At 8 in the morning, Christiana boards her flight. Meanwhile, as part of their standard checklist before takeoff, the crew calculates the weight of all the baggage, passengers, and fuel on the plane. That's to make sure the plane isn't overweight, and the weight is spread evenly. It's a calculation that's made on all commercial aircraft.
So we got a full house back there?
You can count 19 people in the back. Don't know the bags yet.
Okay.
But baggage handlers raise concerns that the luggage they're loading may be too heavy.
Damn. Captain, how many we gotta take off?
We're figuring it out.
Cool. 17,018.
17,120 is our weight, huh?
Yeah, is our max.
So, we're cool.
So, yeah.
Good morning. Welcome aboard U.S. Airways Express service to Greenville, Spartanburg.
It's a very short flight, maybe 30 minutes gate to gate, so sit back, relax, and we'll have you there in a few minutes.
Before takeoff, the crew checks the flight controls, including the rudder and elevator, which help control the direction of the plane.
Flight controls, free and correct.
Air Midwest 5481, runway 18 right.
Taxi into position and hold.
Captain Leslie is moments from takeoff. On the runway ahead of them is a Bombardier CRJ ready for departure.
That CRJ sure is a good-looking plane, isn't it?
Yeah, wish I was flying it.
With powerful turbulence released from the CRJ, Captain Leslie must keep a safe distance.
They're gonna blast us with his jet blasts.
Air Midwest 5481,
turn right heading
230. Cleared for takeoff.
Set takeoff power, please.
Power is set. 80 knots, cross-checked.
At 80 knots, pilots check that key instruments are working. With no signs of trouble, Leslie and Gibbs proceed with their takeoff. To air traffic control, Flight 5481's takeoff roll is perfectly normal.
Gear up.
What?
But without warning, the plane's nose pitches dramatically upward from 7 to a staggering 54 degrees.
Oh, help me! You got it?
The crew struggles to get the nose back down again. Airflow over the top of the wings creates lift. But if the nose keeps rising, air won't flow smoothly over the plane's wings. The plane will lose its lift, stall, and plunge from the sky.
Push the nose down! Oh my God! We have an emergency on Air Midwest 5481.
Alert 3 standby, runway 18 right.
The controller handling Flight 5481 calls for emergency equipment.
Oh my God.
The plane is now 350 meters from the ground. It stalls, rolls to the left, and begins falling from the sky. Captain Leslie pulls on her control column with all her might. If she can't get the plane to climb, she's going to hit the ground. Air traffic controllers watch as a 19-passenger plane plunges towards the Earth. Captain Katie Leslie struggles desperately to get her plane to climb, but it won't respond. The plane heads towards a packed U.S. Airways hangar. The flight was loaded with almost 1,000 kilograms of highly flammable jet fuel just before takeoff. The impact instantly ignites all that fuel. Now the intense fire threatens to engulf the hangar. There are several airplanes and hundreds of people working inside.
Fire signal. Emergency? Engine crash. The plane is crashed. Yes, at the U.S. Air Maintenance ramp, running toward the building, there's a fire.
Code 10, aircraft crash. The south end of runway 36 left. I repeat, a confirmed aircraft crash on fire.
38-year-old Fire Chief Keith Rogers is driving to work when he gets a Code 10 call.
Code 10 means that there's a confirmed plane crash. But usually, this type of call is a once-in-a-career type of incident.
Cindy Overcash is a firefighter with the Charlotte Fire Department.
You couldn't actually see the hangar from here, but you just saw a huge black plume of smoke. And we knew, something really bad is here.
In the adjacent building, sales director David Isola hears the explosion.
Well, I was sitting at my desk, and I heard this loud boom. And one of the guys came in from next door and said that he just saw an airplane crash. And so I hopped in my truck and drove down to the site.
From 60 meters away, Isola records the opening moments of the tragedy.
There was a lot of smoke, and it was just like hell. It looked just like hell. The flames were coming over the fence, just total craziness. Everybody was just running for their lives.
When Chief Keith Rogers arrives at the scene, he finds himself swimming upstream against a mob in panic.
As I got onto the airport property and got onto the tarmac, the people were exiting the hangar. Those people were running out in front of the fire trucks, the fire cars, so we had to drive with caution. They were getting out of the building as fast as they could, because I think they definitely realized that this was not a drill, this was a real emergency.
And we still weren't sure if we had a plane inside the hangar that had caught on fire, or if the hangar had caught on fire. It was quite a while before we realized a plane had hit the hangar.
Chief Rogers immediately takes command of the scene. He knows that there are aircraft parked inside the flaming hangar. Their fuel tanks threaten to blow.
And our concern was, one, about the people that were on board the aircraft, two, for the people that were working in the hangar, and three, we had to worry about the airplanes that were in for repair. Were those aircraft on fire? So we had a lot of major issues to deal with.
Within minutes, firefighters begin to get the inferno under control. The hope now is that somewhere inside the wreck, survivors are clinging to life.
The main thing probably was on anybody's mind once we realized what we had was survivors.
Chief Rogers sends a line of firefighters led by Cindy Overcash into the heart of the inferno. Cindy Overcash and two of her team make their way into the wreckage, carefully putting out spot fires along the way.
As we walk up on to see the fire and we see what we think are crash test dummies, we thought a plane had blown up inside and blew their training dummies out. And then it dawned on me. That's not a training dummy.
It took them a few minutes to determine exactly what was happening, and once they did that, it was obvious that there were no survivors.
It's a total loss. All 19 passengers, as well as Captain Leslie and First Officer Gibbs, are dead.
At about 8:53 this morning, we had an aircraft accident. It had 19 passengers and 2 crew. There are no survivors.
And we hope that we never have to respond to a situation with such a large loss of life, but that is our job. This is some of the most difficult duty and tasks that a firefighter will ever do in their career.
For medics and rescue workers, the ordeal is over. But for friends and family of the victims, the anguish has just begun.
I was walking through the living room, and I stopped and said, my heart's beating right now just the way it was then, said, "Has Christiana called yet?" She said, "No." Okay, and I knew then what had happened. I knew. So I went and got the telephone and called the school. He said, "Yes, Mrs. Shepard, we have some sad news." And he told me that the plane had crashed on takeoff. I asked if there were any survivors. He said no. So then I knew I had to go tell Doug, and he was in the garage.
Yeah, it's something you never forget about. I was changing a fluorescent bulb, and Teresa came to the doorway.
How do you say that? You use words every single day. How can you use words to ruin someone's life? But I told him, I said, "Doug, Christiana's plane crashed."
At that moment, my world fell apart.
Now the Shepards and the families of the other 20 victims want to know what caused the deaths of their loved ones. It's been almost 5 hours since Flight 5481 crashed into a hangar in Charlotte, North Carolina. With no survivors to rescue, neither bodies nor airplane parts are moved from where they fell until the arrival of investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board. While medical examiners mark the location of human remains in red, NTSB investigators mark scraps of metal in yellow, looking for clues to help them figure out what happened aboard Flight 5481. Among those assigned to this case, lead investigator Lorinda Ward. This is her first assignment as the lead investigator of a crash. But today, she's not feeling her best.
That day, I was a little bit under the weather. I was fighting off a cold. You have the adrenaline that shoots through your body at the time, and so that actually makes up for when you're not feeling well. And I knew that the other people on my team were experienced, so I felt comfortable going to Charlotte.
At Charlotte Douglas Airport, Ward takes the first steps towards solving this accident.
I checked in with the fire department to make sure that the fires had been put out, and then called a meeting with all the first responders to see what they had noticed when they came to the crash site.
Ward acts fast. Because there are bodies entangled with the wreckage, she declares the crash site a potential biohazard. Investigators who might come in contact with the wreckage must wear protective suits while they examine the wreck and identify the victims' remains.
When we arrived on scene, the accident site did not look like an airplane was there. Due to the fire, the post-crash fire, when you initially walked up to it, it was hard to identify that you had an airplane that could hold 21 people.
While work continues at the crash site,
All right, let's go.
Lorinda Ward and her team look for clues nearby.
We had the folks go shoulder to shoulder on the runway that the accident crew took off on to pick up anything that they saw on the runway to see if it had any relevance to the accident investigation.
Runways must be clear of all debris. The smallest object can become a deadly projectile if it strikes a plane on takeoff. 3 years earlier, a Concorde jet ran over a 40-centimeter strip of scrap metal on a Paris runway. The plane's fuel tank was pierced and caught fire. The aircraft rose to 200 meters before it crashed into a nearby hotel. 109 people on board and 4 people on the ground were killed. At Charlotte Douglas International, investigators scour the area. they find a fuel cap lying dangerously close to the runway.
What we got?
It could be sucked in and it could damage an engine. The main part would be the damage that it could do to an engine.
The discovery raises an interesting possibility. As Flight 5481 raced down the runway at takeoff, the fuel cap bounced up off the tarmac, struck the engine rotors, and brought Captain Leslie's aircraft crashing to Earth.
This was to be brought back to see if it had any relevance to the accident investigation, whether it came off the airplane itself or if it could have done some type of damage to the airplane.
A closer examination leads Ward and her team to conclude that the fuel cap could not have interfered with the propellers. Investigators discover no other relevant debris on the runway. The runway debris theory is ruled out. Now, NTSB air traffic control investigator Bill English explores another scenario.
When we first heard about the accident, it looked like there might be the possibility that we'd want to look at a wake turbulence encounter.
The wings of a fast-moving jet disturb the air around them, creating a trail of violently swirling air. NASA tests decades earlier had illustrated the power and danger of wake turbulence to other planes.
We had to see, did another airplane depart before it? That's where wake turbulence hazard would come from. And we wanted to look at what kind of airplane departed ahead of it. Larger, heavier airplanes are the more risky wake turbulence creating airplanes.
Bill English examines radar records from the time of the accident. He learns that a much heavier Bombardier regional jet, a CRJ, took off moments before the beach.
The CRJ sure is a good-looking plane, isn't it?
Yeah, wish I was flying it.
The wake turbulence is generated from the wingtips of any airplane. As soon as it starts to lift off the ground, it makes what people sometimes call horizontal tornadoes, vortexes of air that can create hazardous turbulence.
Runway 18 right.
Taxi into position.
Air traffic controllers do have standard procedures for spacing out airplanes so that they have a chance to avoid the wake turbulence or let the wake dissipate.
1 year earlier, an American Airlines jet taking off from New York encountered wake turbulence. The plane crashed into a residential neighborhood. 260 people on the plane and 5 people on the ground were killed.
You're gonna blast us with his jet blasts.
Air Midwest
5481.
cleared for takeoff.
Air traffic investigator Bill English must now determine if wake turbulence from the CRJ caused Flight 5481 to crash. Bill English studies the flight path of Captain Leslie's plane and finds it consistent with a plane flying into wake turbulence.
A pitch up is not unheard of in a wake turbulence encounter where the airplane will suddenly go nose up and the crew has trouble to counter that and get the nose back where it belongs.
English needs to know how close the Air Midwest flight got to the larger jet. The Charlotte Tower has a sophisticated computer system that tracks the movement of planes while they're still on the ground. The system gave Bill English his answer.
That system had a very rapid update, so we could see exactly where on the runway and at what time the regional jet lifted off compared to when the accident airplane started its roll.
When Bill English plots the precise position of the planes at liftoff, he makes a telling discovery. Even though both planes used the same runway, their paths never crossed.
The RJ started lifting off much farther down the runway than the accident airplane did, and the climb-out angle of the regional jet and the climb-out angle of the accident airplane never intersected. The angle of the accident airplane was very steep. It really had no possibility of intersecting the wake turbulence from the regional jet. So if our airplane lifted off and climbed above the angle of the previous airplane, we knew then that it couldn't possibly be a factor.
The wake vortex theory is ruled out, and Bill English's work is done. Now it's up to Ward and her crew to find clues in the burnt-out wreckage of the plane. Within 2 days, her investigation will reveal a string of errors and faulty assumptions that has been putting tens of thousands of passengers at risk for years. Within hours of the crash, investigators find the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder from Air Midwest Flight 5481. The recorders are designed to withstand temperatures of up to 1100 degrees Celsius. In this crash, parts of the voice recorder had actually melted. The devices are photographed and sent for analysis. Then, amongst the tons of debris on the ground, investigators discover the shredded remains of the elevator control cables. Vital to flight control, these cables link the pilot's control columns to the flight elevator, an aerodynamic panel that helps pilots climb and descend. Turnbuckles keep the cables taut. To climb, pilots pull on the column. The cables pull the elevator up, forcing the nose to rise. To descend, pilots push on the control column. The cables tilt the elevator down, and the nose falls. But as investigators examine the burnt-out cables and turnbuckles on Captain Leslie's plane, already something looks wrong.
They looked unusual. They weren't in like the normal position that you would find them. In this case, we had one adjusted all the way out, and then one adjusted all the way in. So those were set aside for us to look at later.
While the lab work continues, NTSB investigator Stephen Carbone travels to Huntington, Virginia. He interviews mechanics who worked on the plane the day before the crash.
At the time, we had known that it had just come out of a detail check, which is a routine check. And knowing that, we were looking into the possibility that something had been done during the check that needed to be looked at from an investigation point of view.
The cables needed servicing. My guy wrote up a service order, and I put them on it. Don't forget the manual.
Got it.
Every 1,200 flight hours, Air Midwest planes go in for routine maintenance work. This includes adjusting the cables that control the plane's elevator.
In the process of doing this check, he found that the mechanic had found that the cables were out of limits. So he had written up that he was going to check the cable tensions and then adjust them as per the manual.
Everything's right.
The mechanics tell Carbone that the work was checked and stamped for quality assurance.
They believed that the aircraft was properly rigged as per the manual.
At first glance, that belief appears to be right. After maintenance, this Beech aircraft took off and landed 9 times without incident before Captain Leslie took the helm. Investigators turned to the flight data recorder to learn what happened on those flights. The flight data recorder stores data from numerous flights, both before and after the plane's cables were adjusted. No one on any of those flights had encountered any problems with the plane's elevator.
So at the time, we didn't know how that affected the airplane because it had flown 9 times successfully before the accident flight.
Ward also discovers that the crew tested their elevator controls before Flight 5481 took off.
Flight controls, free and correct.
Air Midwest 5481.
Ward and her team dig deeper, looking to discover if the unusual configuration of the elevator cables could have played a role in this crash. What they find strikes at the very heart of what went wrong. Normally, both turnbuckles are almost exactly the same length. But on Captain Leslie's plane, one turnbuckle is noticeably longer than the other. To establish the correct cable tension, mechanics tighten the turnbuckles. But too much tightening of a turnbuckle shortens the cables and cuts the range of motion of the elevator control. The elevator should be able to tilt to a nose-down position of 14 degrees. But their downward range has actually been cut in half to only 7 degrees. The result is deadly. As the flight got underway, the nose pitched up as expected during takeoff.
What?
Push the nose down! Oh my God!
But the reduced range in the elevator made it impossible for the pilots to bring the nose down again.
Due to the adjustment that had been done in the maintenance a few nights earlier, there was nothing that the crew could have done at that time.
Unable to bring the nose down, the pitch of the wings became too pronounced. With no air flowing over the top of the wings, the plane lost its lift and began falling from the sky. The pilot's struggle with the elevator helps explain why Flight 5481 crashed that day. Somehow, the elevator cables were improperly adjusted. The pilots simply could not control the pitch of their airplane. Stephen Carbone wants to know how mechanics had made such a critical mistake.
Yeah, I see that here.
He goes back to the hangar to question the mechanics on duty that night. And this time they tell him a different story.
Most of the guys were just learning the ropes.
The mechanics working on the airline were subcontractors to the contract company. And the mechanics working on the aircraft that night had limited experience on the Beech 1900D. And the person performing the rig was receiving training that night on that specific task.
Once you have the rig pin set, adjust the turnbuckle barrels for more tension in the cable.
Yeah, I see that here.
Adjusting the elevator cables is not a simple process. It's a time-consuming procedure that involves 25 different steps.
Got it. What about the other steps?
Yeah, don't worry about those. Just check the cable tension when you're done, and we're good. That's it.
The quality assurance inspector and the mechanic took it upon themselves to decide which steps to perform because they felt that the steps they were performing were the only ones necessary to get the task done.
The mechanic skipped 9 steps that night. One of those involved manipulating the elevator through its full range of motion. Had the mechanic tried to do that, he would have noticed that the elevator's motion was restricted by cables that had been improperly rigged.
If they had followed the steps as described in the manual, they would have found the problems that had come up.
But there was an inspector supervising the work. Carbone discovers that the inspector was actually the person teaching the mechanics how to do the work.
The problem was that the quality assurance inspector was actually acting as an instructor. So he was taking the mechanic through the process of the job task and teaching him how to do the rig. Well, when you put yourself in that position, you're actually doing the task because even as a teacher, you're performing the task. And then he came in behind himself and then signed off as an inspector what he had done.
Well, I found out that this mechanic had skipped procedures. I was upset. The procedures that affected our lives, that affected the lives of 21 people, 21 families were destroyed. Because you never get over something like this.
The Shepherds sue the airline. They also demand something unheard of in U.S. aviation, an apology.
They wanted more than just to achieve a just settlement in monetary terms. They had a need to press the issues that humanize and put a face on the people who are the victims of these tragedies.
The Shepherds believe that their best chance of getting an apology is by putting a face to Christiana's name.
So we decided to take this picture and to send it to those people that were involved in the accident, in the investigation, so that Christiana would not be just a number or a seat number or a ticket number or a settlement amount, so that they could actually see that she was a person.
The legal journey began when we determined that we wanted the apology, that we wanted someone to say, we really blew this. We assumed the airline would apologize. We had no idea that airlines don't apologize. They did something wrong, obviously you should stand up and say, we are so sorry that we messed up in this and we're fixing this.
In this case, the mechanics thought they were doing something that was perfectly reasonable. They thought this was, another day at the job. And then to come to find out that now 21 people have been, killed due to their inadvertent act.
For Lorinda Ward and her team, it looks like they've found the problem. But something still doesn't add up. Why didn't the problem with the plane's faulty rigging surface on any of its previous flights?
We kept scratching our head wondering, okay, this airplane flew 9 times previously and we had no problems. So we're trying to decide, well, what was unusual about this flight?
Ward has to figure out what happened in the hours and minutes before the crash.
And did you notice anything unusual before takeoff?
Well, it was sitting low when it taxied out. It looked heavy.
We had a couple of witnesses that were implying that we had a very heavily loaded airplane. The baggage people said that it was hard to shut the door because they thought bags were going to come out.
Each plane has a maximum weight it can handle before the engines can't get it off the ground. Before takeoff, it's the pilot's job to calculate the onboard weight.
We got a full house back there?
How many we gotta take off?
We're figuring it out.
The crew of Flight 5481 did perform that calculation.
Cool, 17,018.
We heard them on the CVR going through the numbers to make sure that they'd have their center of gravity within the range for them to take off.
17,120 is our weight, huh?
Yeah, is our max.
On any plane, large or small, the weight of cargo and passengers has to be distributed evenly. The balancing point of an airplane is called its center of gravity. For a plane to fly safely, it can neither be too far forward nor too far back or aft.
So, we're cool.
So, yeah.
We don't think we're gonna have to take anything off.
Air Midwest pilots are instructed how to make weight and center of gravity, or CG, calculations. They use average weights to make that calculation, 175 pounds per passenger and 20 pounds per bag.
They knew that they had a very aft CG, but due to using the average weights and average calculations, the paperwork showed them being within the range that they needed to take off.
But Ward needs to know if the plane really was within the proper range of weight and balance to take off.
What we did is we looked at the weights of the actual baggage itself that was on board and then the weight of the passengers and the crew.
Technicians weigh the remains of the burnt luggage from the wreckage site.
Doctor, yes, could you tell me please what the last recorded weight of your patient is, please?
And obtain the real weight of passengers on board that day.
212. Thank you.
When all the numbers are in, Ward discovers the real weight of Flight 5481 is 17,700 pounds, some 580 pounds over its maximum takeoff weight.
They would not have been able to take off if they had used actual weights. They would have had to pull either passengers or bags off.
Because of the higher than expected weight of the passengers and baggage on the flight, and the large number of bags stowed in the rear, the airplane was tail heavy. its center of gravity ever so slightly too far to the rear, which wasn't a problem until the landing gear was raised.
Gear up.
When the gear's weight moved backwards from the nose, it tipped the balance of weight too far back. The pilot's efforts to regain control of the aircraft were futile, crippled by the airplane's defective elevator controls.
When the nose gear moved aft, they lost the ability to control the aircraft because all the weight went back and they had no elevator movement enough to bring the nose back down. And at the height that they were at, they had no recovery.
The passengers and crew of Flight 5481 were doomed the moment the plane left the ground. They had no way of knowing that two unrelated problems would combine to bring down their plane.
This was just a normal routine flight for them, and they did all the pre-flight checks, they did their weight and balance, they did the correct calls, they're on the right runway. It was just another day at the job, and they didn't know that they had these two hidden, latent failures that were waiting for them.
But faulty maintenance and above-average weights weren't the only issues uncovered by Lorinda Ward's investigation.
Hey, you got a sec? I have an idea.
Lorinda Ward suspects she's uncovered problems that didn't just affect this one flight, but that also affected every commuter plane in the air. NTSB investigators say that every plane crash makes flying safer. Flight 5481 was no exception. 14 months after the accident, lead investigator Lorinda Ward and her team file a comprehensive report to ensure the mistakes that killed those aboard Flight 5481 are never repeated. Among Ward's recommendations, that the FAA review its average passenger and baggage weights, an average that had not been revised since 1936. And since studies suggest that Americans and other adults were getting heavier from year to year, Ward suspected that the averages were off.
We made a recommendation to the FAA to have the operators go out and survey their operations both summer and winter time to see how accurate these average weights reflected the actual flying public that was getting onto their airplanes.
After conducting a survey of passengers, the FAA comes to a shocking conclusion. The average weight of adult American passengers was 195 pounds, not 175. The FAA also discovered that the average weight of carry-on luggage was being underestimated by 5 pounds per bag.
We had an average weight that were being used that needed to be updated.
Had these higher average weights been in effect on January the 8th, 2003, Flight 5481 would not have been legal for takeoff. Captain Leslie would have had to remove bags and passengers.
48107, cool, 17018.
Air Midwest pilots now use an average weight of 200 pounds per passenger, which means that their Beechcraft planes can only carry 17 passengers, not 19. But Ward's report goes on to say that even with updated industry averages, there's still room for error. Her report states that flying small aircraft will be safest only when airlines stop using average weight assumptions altogether and calculate the real weight on board before takeoff. New technologies are being developed to allow air carriers to measure actual weight and control balance in real time as the plane is loaded. Knowing the actual weight of passengers and baggage is vital. More and more people are flying on small commuter jets. As the cost of jet fuel soars, the smaller fuel-efficient planes become more attractive to airlines. In the United States alone, more than 10 million people a year board planes with fewer than 30 seats.
Smaller aircraft are more sensitive to the weight and balance issue than, say, a larger airplane.
In spite of Ward's recommendations and the available technology, almost 70% of small planes on scheduled flights still use average instead of actual weights. For Doug and Teresa Shepard, there is still another danger that threatens to strike again.
If the FAA took a very active role in their regulation, then subcontracting could actually be a plus. The way it's handled today, the mistakes will just continue.
What about the other steps?
Yeah, don't worry about those. Just check the cable tension when you're done, and we're good.
In her report, Ward states that all air carriers need to provide direct oversight to make sure that even subcontracted work is completed correctly.
This investigation was unique to me personally because it was my first launch as an investigator in charge. This was, in my mind, a significant investigation in the fact that we had the 22 safety recommendations that came out from a small accident investigation.
For the Shepards, the NTSB recommendations come too late. But after a lengthy legal battle, Air Midwest does deliver a rare and formal apology for the mistakes that cost 18-year-old Christiana Shepard her life.
My name is Ron Goldman, and my role here today is I will be introducing the public apology, and then I'll have a few remarks. The public apology is, in aviation cases, unprecedented.
We are here today to remember the victims of Flight 5481 and to offer our apologies, our condolences, and sincere sympathy to the surviving family members of the passengers and crew who perished in the January 8, 2003 crash of Air Midwest Flight number 5481.
The acceptance of accountability suggests that the recommendations made by the safety investigators are not to be taken as a book to throw in a drawer and forget about, but are to be taken seriously, because if you don't take them seriously, there's going to be public accountability as well as private accountability.
What people should never forget is that as we're going about and doing our job day to day, we need to remember the importance of doing our job. Doesn't matter where we're at on the ladder or the corporate ladder, whether we're at the bottom rung or the top rung, we have responsibilities.
It took a complicated string of errors and miscalculations to bring down Flight 5481. But some believe there was one person who performed admirably that day, Captain Katie Leslie. With an unbalanced plane and faulty controls, Captain Leslie could not have saved the flight. But her final actions may have saved some lives.
You know, she's an unsung hero to me because I don't think many people know about what she did and how she was fighting it and trying to pull the plane away from the hangar. And she actually did. She kept it from really more of a head-on hit into the hangar. Which probably saved countless other people from perishing that day.
It was firefighter Cindy Overcash who found the body of Captain Katie Leslie among the wreckage. To this day, Overcash still feels a special connection to the young pilot.
I don't know, I just felt a kinship. I don't know why. I don't know, you know, it could be as simple as I found her. And I was there when she left this world. I don't know, but I thought about her a lot.
Lorinda Ward's investigation could have ended when she uncovered the errors that caused the crash of Flight 5481. By digging a bit deeper, she made flying safer for millions of people. New Hope, Georgia, April the 4th, 1977.
Hello? My husband called me and he said, honey, we've got some bad weather coming in.
Boys, come on in now. Nasty weather's coming.
One of the worst storms in years is moving across the south. Sadie Hurst rushes her children to safety.
We heard this tremendous noise. When I got to the top of the basement steps to close the door, I saw a red reflection of black fire in the door. That's when I saw what was happening.
72 people are killed when a Southern Airways DC-9 falls from the sky.
Boarding pass. Thank you. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
May I see your boarding pass, please?
Certainly.
Just down the aisle on the right, sir. Enjoy your flight.
Thank you.
Boarding pass?
81 passengers board Southern Airways Flight 242, a DC-9 bound for Atlanta, Georgia. Many of them are military personnel from nearby bases. Captain Bill McKenzie and First Officer Lyman Keel have been shuttling passengers across the American South all day.
Who's got the lander?
Not me, says the captain.
Ignition, sir.
Pilots regularly exchange tasks on long days like this one. First Officer Lyman Keel will be handling this leg of the flight. He's an experienced Navy pilot who's been with Southern Airways for 4 years. Before their last takeoff, the crew was handed a weather report for the airports along their route.
Looks like you guys got a good one coming.
The DC-9 was introduced in 1965 to fly frequent short flights. Both of its engines are mounted to the rear fuselage rather than the wings. It was designed for takeoff on shorter runways.
We had a 13 landing day, which was a lot of small stops, about 20 or 30-minute legs in between, and it was sort of the tour of the South.
Skies have been smooth all afternoon, but the weather's worsening. The flight crew is prepared for turbulence.
It was raining in Huntsville, and they said, oh, it's going to be some bad weather, don't serve. So we did not serve from Huntsville to Atlanta, which is a very short route, and we were delighted not to be serving.
I was a little surprised that we took off when we did. I really thought we'd taxi out to the end of the runway and hold for a while because the weather looked so bad. But we taxied out and immediately took off.
At 3:54 p.m., the DC-9 takes off into a hard rain. The short hop to Atlanta should take just 25 minutes. As Southern Airways 242 flies away from Huntsville, the National Weather Service tracks weather that's far worse than the pilots expect. Tornadoes are touching down all across the South.
The weather in the Southeast in the United States can be very treacherous. High humidities, high temperatures are a prescription for thunderstorms. And so with all of that kind of moisture in the air and the high convective heating, you're going to have very large thunderstorms that are associated with heavy rains, hail, icing conditions, and extreme winds. And of course, tornadoes that will be spawned from that kind of action.
Huntsville Air Traffic Control has some concerns about the gathering storm.
Southern Airways 242, I'm painting a line of weather which appears to be moderate to possibly heavy precipitation, starting about 5 miles ahead.
Okay, we're in the rain right now. It doesn't look much heavier than what we're in right now, does it?
It's not a solid mass, but it appears to be a little bit heavier than what you're in right now.
In 1977, most airliners are equipped with the Bendix weather radar. Pilots are trained to avoid regions that appear bright. Where there's light, there's bad weather.
I can't read that. This looks like rain, Bill. What do you think? There's a hole.
There's a hole right there. That's all I see.
The pilots spot a dark area on their radar, a passageway through the storm. They plan to navigate between towering thunderheads over 14,000 meters.
Coming over, we had pretty good radar. I believe right straight ahead. There. The next few miles is probably the best way we can go.
But as they head towards the storm system, they get an ominous report from Memphis Air Traffic Control.
Attention, all aircraft. SIGMET. Tennessee, Southern Louisiana, Mississippi.
SIGMET is short for Significant Meteorological Information, a warning to pilots that dangerous weather is in the region.
Here we go. Hold them, cowboy.
Pilots don't want to be within 50 miles of a lot of those types of thunderstorms for the very reason that the airplane may not be able to handle it, and or the pilots may not be able to control the airplane flying into that kind of activity.
Mackenzie and Keel take a harder look at their weather radar.
It looks heavy. Nothing's going through that.
Mysteriously, the gap the pilots thought they'd spotted no longer seems to exist.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
The storm suddenly gets much worse.
Never heard such loud hail in my life, and in beating on the, sides of the airplane was extremely deafening.
The hail was probably the loudest noise I've ever heard. It sounded like I was in a metal barrel with someone throwing rocks at me.
Please keep your seatbelts fastened. We should be out of this shortly.
Hail the size of baseballs hammers the DC-9, breaking the plane's windshield.
The pilots of Southern 242 had to raise their voices audibly to be heard above the unholy tattoo of this hail, which was buckshotting the airplane. These pilots had never been through anything like this before in their lives.
Which way do we cross here or go out? I don't know how we get through here, Bill.
I know. You're just gonna have to go out.
Yeah, right across that bend.
All clear left, approximately right now. I think we can cut across there.
Mackenzie and Keel desperately seek an escape route from the storm. But as they do, the emergency escalates. The plane loses all electrical power. Without power, Keel must keep the aircraft level without an artificial horizon.
Now the pilots are left to look back out the window and try and orient the airplane with the horizon.
But surrounded by thick cloud, a horizon is difficult to find. It's almost impossible for Lyman Keel to get his bearings.
Southern 242, what's your speed?
Atlanta Air Traffic Control tries to make contact with Southern Airways. They receive no response.
Southern 242, Atlanta, what's your speed?
After I realized that we had a disaster in progress, or something was wrong, I got up and started briefing my passengers.
The flight attendants were very quick in giving us emergency landing instructions. There was not very much time for anyone to start panicking.
Got it back, Bill. Got it back. Got it back.
After 36 seconds in the dark, power returns. The instruments come alive and the radio begins working again. Air traffic control finally gets through to Mackenzie and Keel.
Maintain 15,000, if you understand me. Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
Southern Airways Flight 242 has been instructed to fly at 4,600 meters. But the plane has fallen to almost 4,200 meters.
We're trying to get it up there.
While I was looking out at the front of the left engine, I could see the hail continuing to put more and more dents into the cowling around the engine and into the cone in the center of the engine. And the engine was starting to make sounds like it was quitting.
Okay, 242, we just got our windshield busted. We'll try to get it back up to 15. We're at 14.
Southern 242, you say you're at 14 now?
Left engine won't spool.
Our left engine just cut out.
You say you lost an engine and busted a windshield?
Yes, sir.
My God. The other engine's going too.
Got the other engine going too.
Southern 242, say again.
Stand by. We lost both engines.
Both engines are now out. This DC-9 is a glider, and it's falling at 56 feet per second. They're at 14,000 feet. They don't have a lot of time.
Get us a vector to a clear area, Atlanta.
Lyman Keel adjusts his course to navigate his plane out of the storm. Captain Mackenzie must restart the engines, or they'll be forced to make an emergency landing. Without engines, Southern Airways Flight 242 is plummeting from the sky. There's also another dire consequence of the engine failure. Normally, the engines generate electricity for the instruments, radios, and hydraulics. When the engines quit, all of these systems fail.
APU deployed.
The APU, the Auxiliary Power Unit, is a backup power generator. It will provide electricity to the plane, but it will take more than 2 minutes for it to power up.
Once they had finished their instructions and there was simply a waiting period before we landed, we turned to each other and said that we would all get through this together, and we held hands for a moment.
When the second engine quit, I wasn't aware of what was going on around me. I was so focused on trying to figure out a way to save myself. I knew that sometimes the tail breaks off in an accident, and I felt the further back I could get, the better.
There we go.
After 2 minutes without systems, the Auxiliary Power Unit finally kicks in. The pilots may not have engines, but at least they now have power.
We lost both engines. How about getting us a vector to the nearest place?
Captain Mackenzie needs directions to an airport. The flight can only stay airborne for another 6 minutes. Dorbins Air Force Base is 32 kilometers away. It has a runway that's long enough for a DC-9. It also has full emergency services.
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100.
Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
It's Dobbins weather, Bill. How far is it? How far is it?
Lyman Keel knows Dobbins Air Force Base intimately. He trained there, and it's now his home base as a Navy Reserve pilot. He's landed there frequently.
Declare an emergency, Bill.
Right now, Keel's familiarity with Dobbins is the only advantage this crew has. Less than 16 kilometers away lies the town of New Hope, Georgia. Sadie Hurst sees no signs of an advancing storm.
It was an absolutely beautiful day. The children were playing outside. They were riding their bicycles up and down the driveway.
Hello? Hey, you.
My husband worked in Atlanta, and he kept his radio on the Huntsville radio station. And he called me and he said, honey, we've got some bad weather coming in. He said, you need to get the kids in.
Boys, come on in now. Nasty weather's coming. Come in now. All right, flashlights and batteries, Stephen.
Ordinarily, tornadoes come with bad weather, you know, dark clouds and rain and hail. But we didn't see any of that.
Southern Airways 242 finally breaks through the storm clouds into clear skies. The plane descends steadily through 2,100 meters.
Get those engines started.
Once the engines failed, the workload in the cockpit increased substantially. In this particular instance, the first officer was the, quote, pilot flying. He was the one that was actually manipulating the flight controls and maneuvering the airplane. The captain, on the other hand, was now running checklist and trying to troubleshoot.
Listen, we lost both engines, and I can't tell you the implications of this. We only got 2 engines. And how far is Dobbins now?
Southern 242, 19 miles. Do you have 1 engine running now?
Negative. No engines.
I didn't know what was wrong, but I could tell something was wrong. I went and opened the cockpit door simply to tell them we're ready for whatever.
Just don't stall this thing out.
No, I won't.
Bill, what's going on?
Not now, Kathy. Sit down.
You could tell they were afraid. I understood that they were afraid just for the sound of their voice. So I understood that there was something very dangerous going on, but I had no idea what.
Down to only 1,400 meters, the plane is still 27 kilometers from Dobbins Air Force Base.
Ask him if there's anything between here and Dobbins.
What?
Ask him if there's anything between here and Dobbins.
Is there an airport between our position and Dobbins?
Southern 242, no, sir. Closest airport is Dobbins.
First Officer Lyman Keel doesn't think he can get the DC-9 as far as Dobbins Air Force Base. He's lost too much altitude.
I doubt we're gonna make it, but we're trying everything to get something started.
Roger. Well, there is Cartersville. You're about 10 miles south of Cartersville.
15 miles west of Dobbins.
Keel needs a closer airport. Cartersville seems like a good choice.
We'll take a vector to that, yes. We'll have to go there.
Can you give us a vector to Cartersville?
All right, turn left, heading 360. Will be direct vector to Cartersville.
Air traffic controllers in Atlanta see no other options. They direct Flight 242 to Cartersville Airport. As the pilots seek out an airport, the flight attendants still don't know what type of landing to prepare for.
They wouldn't talk to me. When I looked in the door, the whole windshield was cracked. So what do we do? I think we've lost both the engines. I thought so. Okay. Kathy, have you briefed all your passengers? Mm-hmm.
I realized I was in an emergency situation and I felt like I was going to die, but I decided I would do everything I could to try to help my chances. I had previously collected some blankets and pillows and had gotten my leather jacket off the overhead rack. And I arranged those to make a nest as much as I could for myself.
With tornadoes in the forecast, the community of New Hope is braced for a different type of danger.
After a couple hours of playing outside, my mother called us in to come in because there was bad weather coming our way. We came into the house, and Mother had told us about what was going on, and she said that we need to get downstairs to prepare for the bad weather that was coming.
Southern Airways Flight 242 has lost too much altitude. The pilots come to the frightening conclusion that at the rate they're falling, they can't make it to Cartersville. They must prepare to land now.
I'm picking out a clear field.
Bill, you have to find me a highway.
Let's get the next clear open field.
No, Bill.
See a highway over there. No cars.
Right there. Is that straight?
No.
We'll have to take it.
Lyman Keel decides to bring the plane down onto a rural highway, Georgia State Highway 92. Captain Bill McKenzie radios Atlanta Air Traffic Control with the bad news.
We're putting it on the highway. We're down to nothing.
The clock runs out on Southern Airways 242.
Sweet Jesus.
With no engines, First Officer Lyman Keel lines up the aircraft for an emergency landing on the highway that runs through New Hope, Georgia.
In the last minute, we did a steep left bank in which we were able to see the pine trees that were very close to the aircraft.
Flaps.
They're down to 50.
Oh, God, Bill. I hope we can do it.
Without training on how to land a DC-9 with no engines, First Officer Lyman Keel's attempt is entirely improvised.
Lyman Keel is a young man who has just come back from the proving ground of Southeast Asia, where he was a naval aviator. He learned the niceties of landing on a rolling, pitching aircraft carrier in the South China Sea in the middle of the night. What he was confronted with right now was even a greater test, the greatest test he had ever confronted in his life as an airman.
I'm gonna land right over that guy.
There's a car ahead.
I got it. I got it now. I got it.
Brace for impact!
The Southern Airways flight touches down on State Highway 92.
When the aircraft touched down, the first touchdown was very, very nice. It was smooth. It seemed like it was going to work and everything was going to turn out okay. And then it immediately bounced back up in the air and slammed down.
Each bump that we made seemed to be harder and louder than the previous one.
The plane smashes into New Hope.
Before the plane completely stopped moving, there was fire blowing through the cabin. I felt my face burning, even though I tried to cover it with my leather jacket.
We heard this tremendous noise.
Large sections of Southern Airways 242 litter the entire length of New Hope.
Come on, damn it.
I got my seatbelt loose after a few tries and turned toward the rear of the airplane, and I saw a spot of light. I got up and ran for that light. I could not believe I was alive. I just could not believe it.
Where I found myself after we woke up, sort of indescribable. I was sitting by the front entry door. We have a coat closet that was adjacent to it and the back wall that the jump seat's strapped to. All three of those walls had collapsed and rolled into like a little triangle ball area. And there was just enough room for me inside. And I could see a crack of light, and I thought, I'm going through that crack of light, come hell or high water.
In the very next instant, as if I had just blinked my eyes, instead of seeing the carpet between my feet, I suddenly was looking at blue sky above me. I realized I was lying flat on my back in the dirt. Everything to the left of me was flaming wreckage. I didn't even recognize it as being the plane that I had just been thrown out of. I thought it was maybe a house that we had hit.
Stewardess Sandy Pearl also escapes safely. She's able to help others. Survivors flee the flaming wreckage.
When I got to the top of the basement steps to close the door, I saw a red reflection like fire in the door. That's when I saw what was happening. I saw smoke and fire. And the people that were coming toward me, they weren't screaming, they weren't yelling, they were quiet.
Everything was on fire, and I could see people running toward a house.
I need to use your phone.
I wanted to call the local people or Southern or somebody and say, we've just landed somewhere and we need help.
It just became a blur. They just kept coming.
You help her.
I got back to the kitchen and I was just circled by people. They knew they were in a house, and I guess they felt safe, and they needed somebody to help them. I was still frantic. I was still trying to move as quickly as possible and do as much as I could at the time.
And I'll remember to the day I died just staring there at the trees burning and pine trees burning and pieces of aircraft. It was so unreal. I've never seen anything like it and never want to see anything like that again.
"72 people, including pilots Lyman Keel and Bill McKenzie, die in the crash of Southern Airways Flight 242. Investigators would soon uncover a tragic series of miscues and coincidences that caused the plane to crash.
Southern Flight 242 crashed after the DC-9 jet lost power in both engines. The plane had just flown through a violent hailstorm on a flight from Huntsville, Alabama to Atlanta.
I saw the plane as it came veering down, hit the treetops. We thought it was a tornado at first. Vehicles, people that was in this grocery store yard and vehicles, it actually hit them.
A family of 7 is killed instantly when the plane hit their car.
They were just leaving the store about the time that the flight tried to land on the highway. And then, of course, I think they hit the gas pumps and they exploded and everything around was on fire. And like I said, they were in the car and perished during the explosion and fire.
Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrive within hours of the accident. This is the second major blow to Southern Airways' safety record. In 1970, Flight 932, carrying the Marshall University football team, crashed in West Virginia. Everyone on board was killed.
There are always many questions that investigators have to find answers to. The 2 primary questions that needed to be answered by the board were what were the weather conditions and what caused both engines on a 2-engine airplane to flame out that resulted in the pilots having to make an emergency landing on a highway in a small town.
The storm that Flight 242 flew into was a monster. Why had a crew so familiar with weather in the South flown headfirst into it?
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
Investigators listened to the cockpit voice recorder for any clues about the decisions made by the crew as they were entering the thunderstorm.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
They learned that the pilots relied heavily on their weather radar as they approached the storm. But it appears to have deceived them.
All clear left, approximately right now. I think we can cut across there.
One of the limitations of the radar that the crew of Flight 242 was using is signal attenuation. That is that the beam that is projected from the radar unit out to look at the weather and return is diffused. so that the picture that is depicted in the cockpit that the crew is looking at may not be accurate.
Weather radar sends out radio waves. Those waves bounce off storm clouds ahead and return to the aircraft. But if precipitation is extremely intense, the radio waves can be deflected away. The radar unit might then interpret the lack of returning waves as a clear path ahead.
Those inaccuracies are hard to decipher, and if the crew is depending solely or very intently on the radar to guide them through the precipitation, they may be making decisions that aren't based on accurate information.
The storm that entangled Southern Airways 242 is one of the worst to hit the United States in 3 years. The crew didn't encounter a tornado, but it was battered by torrential rain and heavy hail.
Which way do we cross here or go out? I don't know how we get through here, Bill.
What Keel and Mackenzie read as a clear area ahead was in fact the heaviest part of the storm. They flew straight for it.
The other engine's going too.
Got the other engine going too.
Southern 242, say again.
Stand by. We lost both engines.
Once inside the storm, the DC-9's engines failed. But a turbofan engine is designed to ingest huge amounts of rain and even hail. Precipitation alone should not have shut them down. Investigators study what's left of the DC-9's engines for clues. They need to know if some mechanical failure caused both engines to fail inside the storm.
Well, initially I was puzzled as to how the engines could be involved in the cause of this accident, but I was very anxious to get there to see the engines myself to find out if there was any sort of visible failure in the engines.
Pratt & Whitney, the manufacturer of the engines, assigns Al Weaver to advise the NTSB investigation. The engines are moved to Atlanta Airport for a closer inspection.
And when they lifted the engines up in the vertical direction in the hangar, I could hear the tinkling and pieces fell out through the front of the engine onto the floor. I reached over and picked up those pieces, and I recognized them immediately as part of the high compressor blading deep within inside the engine.
Al Weaver discovers that the pieces that fell from the engine were broken blades from the compressor. Jet engines need pressurized air for combustion. 2 separate compressors inside the engine are made up of dozens of steel blades. The rapidly spinning blades force air to the back of the engine. The pressurized air is ignited in the combustion chamber, creating thrust. Weaver notices that the compressor blades from Flight 242 are badly bent or fatigued. The way they're bent tells him they were damaged in the air, not when the plane hit the ground.
And we know that that fatiguing and the type of fatigue that we could observe with our eye is caused by the repetitive surging of the engine over and over.
A surge occurs when the airflow through an engine gets interrupted. Pressure builds up between the compressors instead of behind them. Without the back pressure, air from the combustion chamber moves to the front of the engine. The engine briefly loses power. Next, investigators need to find out if the repetitive surging was caused by the engines inhaling massive amounts of rain. When an engine ingests rain, it has to convert it into a gas before it can pump it out as exhaust. That process uses energy and slows down the engines. Investigators conclude that with so much rain to convert, the engines couldn't maintain enough power to run the generators. That's what caused the first power outage. But it doesn't explain why the engines failed completely. Al Weaver wants to know if the sheer volume of rain the engines were forced to ingest could have caused their failure. The same engine model that powered Southern Airways 242 is run with up to 14% water to air.
Okay, engines at 3/4 throttle. Let's begin.
Investigators ultimately throw monsoon-level rains against the engine. They run it from idle up to full throttle.
Okay, that's it. Shut it down.
The rain was not enough to cause the kind of surge that tore the engines on Flight 242 to pieces.
Thanks very much, gentlemen.
And the engine operated normally, no abnormalities. So our judgment was we could not conceive of a rainstorm that would put more water in. So we knew we were going in the wrong direction with more water.
The water ingestion test points investigators to another suspect.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
Hail. People who survived the crash describe seeing hail the size of baseballs. It was powerful enough to break the plane's 3.5 centimeter thick windshield. Al Weaver discovers significant hail damage on both of the plane's engine cowlings.
Starting at the front of the engine, we noted that the inlet cowl and the center body that streamlines the airflow going into the engine, which are parts of the aircraft structure and made out of aluminum, were all dented from both engines. And that led us to suspect that the existence of the hail might have been a significant contributor.
Weaver knows that it would take a powerful force to damage the hard metal compressor blades.
We knew from the examination mechanically of the engines that the hail itself did not cause any damage to the engine. It only dented the outside of the covering over the engine.
Heavy precipitation and a damaged cowling could have interrupted the engine's airflow and caused a surge. But one surge shouldn't tear an engine apart. Weaver suspects that massive pieces of hail may have clogged a vital outlet in the plane's engines: the bleed valves. When pressure builds between the two compressors, bleed valves should open automatically to release that pressure and clear the surge. If the bleed valves were blocked, the engines would have continued to surge over and over again.
Once the engine began to surge, the action that the pilot should have taken was to pull the throttles back to clear the surge.
Al Weaver turns to the cockpit voice recorder and discovers that the circumstances may have caused the crew to do the exact opposite.
Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
We're trying to get it up there.
Weaver learns that the crew was asked to climb while in the heart of the storm.
Maintain 15,000, if you understand me. Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
In order to climb, the captain had to increase thrust to his engines, which would have made matters worse.
But if the surge was not cleared and allowed to continue, then the engine would simply break itself internally.
We're trying to get it up there.
Advancing the throttles would only worsen the situation.
With its bleed cavities blocked by hail, pressure built up inside the engines, bending the compressor blades until they shattered.
Left engine won't spool.
Our left engine just cut out.
And once the blades broke in the compressor, then the engine has no hope of ever working again.
Investigators now understand how the pilots misread the storm and how their engines failed as a result of it. But they don't know why the pilots weren't warned that there was such a severe storm in their path.
Who's got the landing?
Not me. Just the captain.
Ignition, sir.
As the pilots prepared to depart Huntsville, they did have a weather report from Southern Airways. But the information was already hours old.
Looks like you guys got a good one coming.
Southern Airways dispatch did not have updated information. They didn't subscribe to the National Weather Service's update system. They did have a subscription to a service that required them to dial up and receive the information. When the dispatcher called the phone number to get the updated information, it was busy and never pursued it, and was not able to provide any kind of update information to the crew of 242.
Southern Airways 242, I'm painting a line of weather which appears to be moderate to possibly heavy precipitation, starting about 5 miles ahead.
Could Huntsville have provided better weather information? Absolutely. But in the course of doing their job, they provided localized weather information about an intense thunderstorm or rain shower that was moving over the airport. They were only responsible really for about 40 nautical miles. What the crew of Flight 242 was looking at was well beyond 40 miles.
With little information on the storm and having misread their weather radar, Bill McKenzie and Lyman Keel flew blindly into massive thunderheads. The heavy rain and hail crippled their engines. The crew decided that their only option was an emergency landing.
We lost both engines. How about getting the vector to the nearest place?
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100. Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
When investigators analyze the flight path of Southern Airways 242, they discover one more deadly oversight.
From the time the crew realized that they had no engine power till the time of touchdown was about 9 minutes. So in looking at the critical decision making, they had about 7 minutes of solid critical decision making before they were committed to that emergency landing on the highway.
Get us a vector to a clear area, Atlanta.
After the engines failed, the pilots made a 180-degree turn towards the west, looking for an escape from the storm. That takes them directly away from Dobbins Air Force Base. The turn takes the pilots out of the hailstorm, but leaves them further away from a runway. They also lose minutes of valuable flying time. Only once the pilots escape the hailstorm do they turn again towards Dobbins.
Is there an airport between our position and Dobbins?
Southern 242, no, sir. Closest airport is Dobbins.
Had they maintained that course to Dobbins, rather than make the turns or try to find another airport, they probably would have had a better success rate and definitely a better survival rate.
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100. Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
By the time Mackenzie received the instructions, Southern Airways 242 had been flying away from Dobbins for too long. The plane was simply too far and flying too low to make it there.
Declare an emergency, Bill.
But there was one last missed opportunity to save Flight 242. Investigators learned that just as Mackenzie and Keel were directed towards Dobbins Air Force Base, they were right above another runway. Cornelius Moore Airport.
I thought we would land at Cornelius Moore Airport because I was familiar with that airport. I had flown many times in our airplane back and forth between Decatur and Atlanta.
Investigators learned that Cornelius Moore was just out of range of radar at Atlanta Approach Control. They didn't know it existed. They could not direct Southern Airways 242 there because they couldn't see it on their screens.
When I learned that the controllers in Atlanta didn't know about the Cornelius Moore Airport in Cartersville, I was upset because we went within, I think, 3 or 4 miles of that airport, had a 4,000-foot runway, and even though some of the controllers thought it was too short, it sure would have been better than that highway we landed on.
I was very, very angry. That's such a futile reaction. You know, there was such a waste of life that I was sad.
The NTSB investigation concludes that the catastrophic failure of the turbofan engines and the failure to convey sufficient information on the storm to the pilots are the causes of the crash of Southern Airways 242. The NTSB acts immediately. It issues a recommendation that weather radar systems aboard planes and in air traffic control centers be upgraded to better portray weather systems.
In today's commercial aircraft, pilots have available to them color weather radar. It's radar that will depict in various color bands the intensity of the precipitation.
The crash of Southern Airways 242 also leads to a better understanding of how engines should be managed in heavy precipitation.
We once again reaffirmed to the pilots the importance not to allow the engine to continue operation in continual surging. If there is a surge condition for any reason, you should clear the surge, because if you didn't clear the surge and allowed it to operate, it would break eventually.
In every air crash, investigators try to determine whether or not the accident was survivable.
When you look at the survivability in an aircraft accident, you can definitively say that the design of the seat contributed to the survival factors aspects. But the statistics that bear out whether sitting in the front of the airplane is safer, the middle of the airplane is safer, or the back of the airplane is safer don't exist. In this particular instance, a surviving passenger, Don Foster, was quick thinking. He put a leather jacket over his head and used a pillow as a buffer between the seat in front of him and his face. That probably saved his life from the standpoint that it minimized any injuries he would have suffered.
In fact, the NTSB believes that if flight attendants had distributed blankets and pillows to the passengers, there would have been fewer injuries as a result of the crash.
We learned from every airplane crash. We learned from this one. We learned that the communication broke down within the FAA, within Southern Airways, even within the cockpit of that DC-9. What we didn't ultimately learn, though, is the most important lesson, and that is awesome respect for Mother Nature and what Mother Nature can do.
30 years have passed since Southern Airways 242 crashed through the small community of New Hope, Georgia. Every 10 years since the crash, survivors of the tragedy gather at a church in New Hope. They remember those that were lost and help one another cope with the tragedy. It's one of the longest-running survivors group of its kind.
I want to welcome you to this service today in remembering April the 4th, 1977, when the Southern Airways Flight 242 crashed here in the New Hope community.
Earl D. Johnson. Lyman Keel, Jr. William Wade McKenzie.
Earl C. Griffin, Jr.
After the crash, I had a hard time understanding how I managed to survive. And after a couple of months, I quit worrying about it. I felt like I had a second shot at it. I felt like that family was more important, having fun was more important.
It took a pretty deep toll on our family, my mother and my father especially. They lost 2 of their children and all their grandchildren all at one time.
And I can still, to this day, I can smell the odors, and I can hear the sounds, and I can see those people. So many things will bring back those smallest memories. And every time it's triggered, the emotions come back. You don't want them to, you don't ask for them, but you can't stop them.
I believe it's important for the survivors to get together so that they can share their experiences, know that there are other people that went through the same feelings that they did.
I mean, I've had a great life because of this, in a way. That makes no sense, but it's changed me for the better. I think I've done better, had a better life because of how I grew from that.
May this service do honor to these dear loved ones, and may it bring comfort and peace to we who remain.